Tiananmen Square, Beijing, the heart of the world's most populous nation. It was here that Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. His picture still gazes down from the gates. Mao's Cultural Revolution, a decade-long series of purges until his death in 1976, had brought great suffering to the Chinese people, with liberties squashed and people imprisoned, tortured and killed. After Mao's death, and having survived several purges himself, Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping led China into a new era, opening the economy up to the West.
Deng Xiaoping, who had been under arrest, came out again and said, why don't we try capitalism? Socialism isn't really working, let's try capitalism. And so all of a sudden, China became a very exciting place. Suddenly people were wearing colors instead of just blue and gray Mao suits. They started wearing red, green, yellow, and there was this idea that maybe the West wasn't such a bad place after all.
But political reform was not moving at the same pace as economic reform.
There was a sense that China was coming out of a shell and moving forward. And then in '87, an anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, and some famous intellectuals were purged, and the secretary of the party who was pushing these reforms was purged, and Hu Yaobang.
Hu Yaobang was forced to resign for his support of the student uprising of 1986. His efforts made him a hero for thousands of students demanding greater freedom. Hu's death on April the 15th, 1989, 2 years after his public shaming, was the catalyst for a protest that would become the biggest modern China had witnessed.
We needed an excuse. And then when Hu Yaobang died, we thought similar, commemorating a former General Secretary of Communist Party is not something that outrageous. I mean, it's something people can do. Government wouldn't be able to just suppress that.
What started as a protest at Hu's treatment grew in momentum. Emboldened, the protesters wrote a list of demands. They poured onto Tiananmen Square.
As university students, we felt we had a social responsibility to fulfill, and we were passionate about our country. The demands made at the time were worthy and just, from dealing with corruption to speeding up the political reform, from media freedom to law and democracy. They were the kind of desires shared by all students in the 80s.
The demonstration started to take the form of an outdoor rock festival.
I walked into Tiananmen Square in April 1989 by coincidence. It was purely for curiosity. You start listening to the students' public speeches, and they were intellectuals. They were so good speeches, and I was so much inspired.
As the protests continued, the students' demands grew. Soon they started asking for democracy. Unsure of how to quell this growing dissent, China's rulers tried publicly denouncing it. On April the 26th, they published a damning editorial in the People's Daily newspaper, calling the protests anti-party and anti-socialist.
Because the labels anti-party and anti-socialist are so divisive and so strong and so frightening, that when you get those labels put on you, you know that a line has been drawn in the sand. I mean, their parents may have been sent to labor camps for 20 years for that kind of label.
That editorial was a blow. People went, oh my God, this is the Communist Party pronouncing its verdict on what it's going to do. So people were really angry, really upset.
Rather than turning the population against the students, the editorial had the reverse effect. In support of the students, policemen, journalists, government workers, and even some members of the armed forces joined the peaceful protests.
On some days, there were 1 million people in Beijing on the streets, and the population then was only 10 million. And so I think everybody was on the streets. I almost couldn't find anyone who hadn't been part of a protest. And if you weren't actually marching, you were gawking.
On Tiananmen Square, the students began organizing themselves into unions.
My experience can prove that this movement is quite a spontaneous one, because I jumped in quite randomly, and in 1 week or 10 days, I came to the highest position. I became the president of the Independent Student Union of all universities in Peking.
With people all over China taking to the streets to openly call for change, the communist state looked fragile. Conservatives within the party now started to lobby for a forceful response. As the Tiananmen Square protests of May 1989 grew, thousands of students and workers camped out on the square. Wild storms failed to discourage them. But some began to lose patience with the government's refusal to discuss their list of demands. On May the 13th, just 2 days before the first state visit to China by a Russian president in 30 years, 3,000 of the protesters went on a hunger strike.
Gorbachev was visiting China, so everyone thought it was a good opportunity. It could really force a dialogue between the government and the students and let the world know what was happening here, and that it wasn't simply a bunch of students causing trouble.
With the situation escalating, Secretary General Zhao Ziyang visited the protesters in the square. They ignored his plea to end their action. Zhao, who was accused of dividing the party, was fired and placed under house arrest. Martial law was declared, and on May the 20th, troops moved onto the streets of Beijing.
As government, instead of a response to the students' request for dialogue, you put out the martial law. That was the worst decision they made. When the martial law declared, probably a few hours of fear, and then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, more people coming into the street.
People stopped them. People stood in front, and of course the army stopped, and people gave them popsicles and drinks and talked to them, shook hands, and the soldiers really were quite confused. So the martial law, I called it marshmallow law, because nothing happened. And that was a big humiliation for the Communist Party.
After 3 days, the soldiers retreated to the outskirts of Beijing. The protests continued for another 11 days as Communist Party leaders planned their next move. Then, on June the 3rd, 1989, Deng Xiaoping gave the order to clear the square.
Suddenly, the military was coming in from different parts of the city. All 4 corners of Beijing, they were marching in. And there were tanks and armored personnel carriers.
A lot of us arrived and found the army shooting those who were blocking their trucks' way, setting up pedestrian barriers. They were shooting at these people.
The tanks came roaring in, and people tried to stop them by putting a city bus perpendicular to block the road. And I saw the tanks just smash into the bus.
As rumors spread that the army was approaching the square, the students were getting desperate.
I realized that it's my responsibility to organize a vote. But it was all dark. The government have take off all the lights on the square. I said that, okay, now we shout. Yeah, those people who want to stay shout stay. Those people want to leave shout leave. So with these two voices, I compare. I think it's the same level of voice. And finally, I ordered the restraint.
Fearing for her safety, Jan Wong left Tiananmen Square and headed back to the Beijing hotel.
I got to the balcony just in time because the troops did arrive right after that. Saw them coming in and I saw shooting. And then I saw these ambulances start to come out of the square. I don't know why people were cowering. Why didn't they just leave? They didn't. They stayed there as if they wanted to protect the students.
We were moving from east to west, and the tear gas came from behind. One of them exploded among us, and everyone panicked.
People were coming out, and it was dark, so I couldn't tell if they were dead or just wounded. A lot of shooting, and it went on for hours.
The tank was moving fast, right along the curb from behind me. I turned around and the tank was so close that I could see the cannon above my head. I fell on the ground, then I felt the tank going over my body. I was still conscious. I felt I was being crushed by something heavy. I was dragged along for a while, and I would never forget how it felt. My head and my back was bumping against the hard cement ground. I remember that very well.
The break of dawn did not stop the onslaught.
All night I was sitting on the balcony watching this, almost like a ballet. And there weren't enough ambulances, so I saw pedicab drivers. I saw them racing into the square and coming out with bodies piled on their carts.
Overnight, the Chinese Red Cross issued a statement saying 2,600 people had been killed. That figure was rapidly retracted. The Chinese government claimed that 241 people were killed, including 23 soldiers. 7,000 people were injured.
I never thought they will send soldiers with guns shooting people with the real bullet. Most likely, I thought they will use wooden stake coming in and beating us up. That's what I was telling people. I said, let's get ready. So I never thought they were really shooting bullets into people's heads and people's chests.
The troops were back in charge of the capital, but a day later, it was obvious the spirit of defiance wasn't dead.
I was still in the Beijing hotel, and my husband was with me, and he said, you better get out here. So I ran out on the balcony, and I saw this guy, a young man in a white shirt, holding some bag, and I thought he's going to get squashed because they had run over people. There was a long line of tanks, as long as you could see down the main boulevard. And he's like a soccer goalie. He's like going to stop this tank. And to my surprise, the lead tank stopped. I see the man climb up onto the tank. And I go, are you crazy? Are you nuts? And he seems like he wants to talk to the people inside. After a moment, he gets down again. And then you see the tank actually twist to one side to go around this nutty guy. And the man jumps in front of him. And then the tank goes the other way, and the man jumps in front, and then the tank stops. And suddenly, two guys from the sidelines drag him to safety. And he's become the symbol, but he's a mystery. We don't know who he is.
In the days and weeks that followed, the Chinese government cracked down on the survivors. They arrested hundreds, accusing them of being counter-revolutionary or for disrupting the social order.
As young students, we were brought up in such a way that we still had some faith in the government and the party. So at the beginning of the students' movement, we had hoped that the party would carry out further reform, be more open, and gradually bring democracy and human rights to China. We thought we could push for changes from within. After June the 4th, I lost both my legs. My dream was broken. How could a government behave like this?
5 months later, the peaceful fall of communism in Europe began with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Today, most of the Tiananmen Square protest leaders live in exile. They are unlikely to see their families or their country again. In modern China, the liberalization of the economy continues at a rapid pace. Prosperity and censorship has meant that what happened in Tiananmen Square is now forgotten by the new generation of young Chinese.